Hey everyone, so glad you can join me for my review of April's book of the month. Normally, I try to do this as a live stream, but I had to just switch it up this month, and I might just see if this format works a little better going forward. So, we've been talking about Joe Dispenza's Becoming Supernatural. This is a bestseller, you've probably come across it. Now, first things first, I do want to say that this is a dense book, although it's not difficult. It's not a weekend read, and judging by how I've been going through it, it's not even necessarily a 1 month's read. If you're actually like following everything and absorbing it in full, which is the way that I like to read. Um, One of the strengths of this book is how much he does rely on deductive logic. So he is showing you the exact steps that he's been able to make in his argument. And right here is probably my only like surface level criticism of this text, which is that from an editorial point of view, this could have been a little bit shorter. Like there are parts where it definitely absolutely gets repetitive, and I probably would have cut those out. Once you've shown the links, like you don't need to show them twice. But again, that's pretty surface level. That's not, a criticism of the substance or the argument at all here. So my hope with these reviews, of course, is that this can help save you time, and I hope that this benefits you because it's really like in my nature to dive deep into works like this. I enjoy it. It's kind of effortless. And so if I can share that with you, great. I can save you time. And if you'd like to follow along each month, I would love the company and I would love your support. So if you want to, I run this study club monthly across a few different platforms here on YouTube and on Substack. So if you would like, you can go over and join me there as a subscriber, either free or paid tier. The paid tier does directly support these monthly book reviews, as well as my video production and the private community, as well as bringing on future guests and authors. So I'll have a link to that below, and I would just like to share in advance my appreciation of you for that level of support because it means a lot. Let's just dive right in now to what the book is doing and what this book represents. So for those not familiar, this was published initially in 2017 by Hay House, and it's still a bestseller. He's since got a series, of course, it runs on Gaia, which is maybe where you've come across his work. And that series really like continues the teachings that you get in this book. So this book, if you are already really familiar and you've watched a lot of Rewired, a lot of this book will probably be the same material, like presented, of course, more succinctly. The basic idea with this book is that this is an argument about the spiritual level of human evolution. And it draws upon the empirical research that he has studied, conducted, and replicated himself with regard to the shifts in electromagnetic fields that are created by the human body. Now, these can be studied in several ways empirically. So there are many types of brain imaging, heart imaging, Kirlian photography, skin conductance tests, and more. So this topic is actually very accessible to experimentation, and especially to all of our latest technologies in data analysis. But the book includes a lot more than that. There are also quite a few color inserts in the middle, which if you're familiar with the publishing world, this is a pretty big deal. It means that Hay House like really invested a lot into this book. So they knew what they were doing. Now, let's just start with the topic of human evolution, and then in the second half of this, I'm going to go into more of some of the specific and concrete action steps that he covers for how to engage in this evolution on an individual level, where the focus becomes about balancing our vital energies and reinvigorating our overall electromagnetic field. And this is all can be considered the process of healing and integration. So just as a quick side note though, I am only about like 60% total through this book, I would say. So I will be giving a more an overall and complete analysis with the rest of the details in the review that I write on Substack later this month. So once again, I'd love it if you subscribe over there. And that's a perfect way you can also like help support this work going forward. And I will be bringing in future guests and hopefully some of the authors that I'm talking about. Fingers crossed. So, okay. So there's a lot of ideas out there about human evolution, how it works, what it entails, what makes Homo sapiens what we are, if we're different, how we're different from other species, and also where we're not so different in all the ways that we like to imagine or used to imagine that we are. So we used to hear a lot about, oh, humans are the only ones that use tools. Nope. We're also not the only ones who have a self-image, and we are not the only ones who have an understanding of our own death. So this is also all about both like how human development has occurred over the very long term geological history, as well as in much more recent intervals. So this is what's happened specifically following the Industrial Revolution and the rise in mass media. Very clear shifts with movements to urban areas. We have so much rich sociological analysis that's showing actual links and changes in our perceptual system as a result of this. Following the First World War, it's just incredible the level of analysis that was done, showing on a very short time scale how much evolutionary processes are in play. And what is evolution? It's just the nature of change. It's as much about just the process of change and direction itself as about the human past. So today, of course, we sit face to face with the threats and promises of a very powerful artificial intelligence. And big technological jumps like these always call into question the nature of what the human really is and what it could be. If we want to simplify things, we can say that there's basically two paradigms of thought about how and where human evolution can go from here. One of these is encapsulated in what we can call a transhumanist view. There's different variations and subtleties in here, but like in general, you can put them in the same bucket. On this view, basically the biological body is seen as a limitation, and technological development is something we're meant to engage in order to get beyond biological limitations. Biology is seen as a limitation. So this camp is all about digitizing our biology, reducing our minds to discrete logic gates and instantiating them on a silicon chip or other machine and uploading everything to the cloud. So in the millennial years, the early 2000s, many of these people were huge advocates of cryonics. And this is basically deep freezing the human body so that at some future date you could like reanimate once the medical technology is good enough and everything was safe and would be viable. And just as a fun side note, I was developing my own documentary on this. At the time, I never finished it, but I was speaking with one of these guys who was doing it, and he had taught himself, according to his own judgment, he had taught himself heart surgery so that he could directly help with this type of transition for people who were interested in that process. And he was like giving me a live demonstration, not on a live person, but he had like a table set up and everything. So super interesting. Probably worked out that I didn't actually finish that documentary. I went to grad school. So look, the alternative view to this, to the transhumanist paradigm, is what we might just call organic evolution. And now these basic paradigms have also been referred to as like organic versus synthetic timelines, which is pretty accurate. On this organic view, there is still untapped potential within the human body. Just as we only ever use like 5% of our conscious brains in conscious awareness, for example, we've barely activated, I think it's about like 10% of our DNA or something like that, very similar. And the rest of it is just colloquial known as junk DNA. And so this is kind of analogous to like the whole visible universe is probably only 10%, and then everything else is like this dark energy, dark matter, and we have like still no clue about other forms or forces that may be composing our reality. Going back again to the transhumanist view, the body doesn't change, but technology does. So there's a focus on our nature as hardwired, and computational metaphors will really take over here. They're huge in descriptions of the mind. And again, emphasis is placed on where technology can go. What can we invest in technology? Whereas the organic or humanist view emphasizes and recognizes how much biology does actually change. It is not like fixed in stone, it also evolves quite literally in the evolution of species, but also on smaller scales, as I mentioned, and on the microscopic scale through vectors of neuroplasticity and epigenetics. So, this organic view privileges the intrinsic intelligence of biology and acknowledges that we don't even know yet all there is to know about our anatomy. So, and this is quite literally in the case of the brain, where so much focus has gone on to what neurons supposedly do, and very little research still into glial cells and other types of cells that compose like this massive filter on consciousness, basically. This organic view of humanity this organic view of humanity also seems to do a better job of showing the continuity that exists between each technological paradigm, between each technological development. So it's kind of a counterposing or opposite type of emphasis as the transhumanist paradigm, which assumes that biology doesn't change and we have to put everything into technology. So we know that paradigm really well, actually, because it works hand in hand with our economic system, with all the current dominant social structures. So basically, technology is always sold to us as new, it's sold to us as the solution, where the assumption is that anything that is new is automatically and intrinsically better and represents a form of progress. And assuming that we need this level of externality, not necessarily in order to evolve, but the emphasis here is more like so that we don't fall behind. It's kind of an intrinsically survivalist point of view. It's the survival brain talking. We better develop our AI before China gets ahead of us, or you better start using ChatGPT, or you won't keep up with your competitors. This is really the dominant and hegemonic view of technology. It's everywhere. And you'll know it because it never contains or welcomes any thought on the adverse consequences which always accompany each new technological introduction. Those who have studied technological history obviously understand this. You don't have to look very deep, you just have to be open and see the continuities. If you were here for my first book review back in February, we looked at Deepak Chopra's latest book, and this is basically his position, just totally dismissive of any kinds of adverse consequences, not willing to consider those. It's just, doomers. But if you're a spiritually minded person and you're focused on your own psychological development, whether this is just for improving relationships or fulfilling your creative potential, you already know the value of working on yourself, which includes your shadow aspects, your inner child, your physical health. And I would say that this dominant view of technology, this really transhumanist view, ignores that. It ignores its own shadow. This is like a huge distinction. With that kind of intro being said, this is the paradigm that Joe Dispenza is working within, not transhumanism, but this organic view. So instead of transhumanism, which literally is denying what is human and trying to find a literal replacement for the human in contempt, instead of that, Joe Dispenza is using the word supernatural, which I think is really interesting as a counterpoint to the concept of transhumanism. So it's interesting too, because I feel like we haven't really heard a lot about this concept of the supernatural. It's like an older term, like it feels like 80s, 90s, when there's a lot of talk about ESP and like books on the Bermuda Triangle. And yet this forms like a really interesting counterpoint to the concept of transhumanism. the meaning of it here, of course, is that we're going super on what's already natural, right? We're going super natural. And it just takes on this new nuance that I really love, and I think it's super productive. So, this paradigm for evolution is not about denying our bodies. This is not about leaving our bodies or replacing what is human. It's about digging into even more untapped potentiality of the human. And I'll add too, importantly, this is also not about denying science or the scientific method, which is actually a mode of logical intuition that is very sacred and intimate to human consciousness, and especially tied in with language and intersubjective consciousness. And we need to be able to separate that aspect of it out from the many different social ways in which the scientific method has been captured and appropriated into various types of technology or forms of economic situations, for example. So, with all that being said, let me share 7 key points of focus in this book's argument, and then I'll end things off with a couple of caveats about, where the book kind of like stops short of including certain details that are probably like best considered like advanced material anyway. So point number 1 is the core of his argument here is what he calls the thinking and feeling loop. Now, this is the heart of the argument, and it's basically that unless we take conscious action infused with higher intent, we are going to remain stuck in so many neurological loops for the rest of our life. They literally run our life. It's 95% of our behavior, basically. It's run by the subconscious mind, which is stored in the body. And this is what he explains. It's the core of everything. So this also fits with what I've talked about earlier in some previous videos where I would talk about like the cybernetic survival loops. This is exactly what I mean. And basically, this is a feed-forward loop that connects our brain areas involved in thinking and imagining with the neurotransmitters that they produce, and then they end up signaling other energy centers in our body through neuropeptides that go on to produce specific emotions. And on this account, emotions can be understood just as specific compositions of chemicals, specific chemical concoctions, as it were. So here it's a good place to remember that Joe Dispenza is not a philosopher. He is working more like, this is more of a biochemical engineering account. It's very focused on causality and functionality within our neurophysiological system. So whereas a philosophical account is like a couple registers up, right? So the explanations for what emotions are and how they work changes on the philosophical level. There's more involved. There's aspects of referentiality and cognition involved with emotion on that level. So I think it's just interesting and important to like separate those points of view, to understand that, these interpretations work on many levels. It doesn't mean one is wrong. It's just you're addressing the phenomenon at a higher level of specificity or generality as necessary. So from this point of view, though, this engineering point of view, we're looking at the causal links. So what are these chemicals actually doing? What are they allowing us to do? What are they causing us to do? Now, so you're already familiar with the main ones, right? Like oxytocin, cortisol, melatonin, dopamine, but there are hundreds of these and more that we still don't know about. So his point here, and he shows this in painstaking detail, this is the repetitive stuff across many chapters, is that we do effectively become addicted to certain chemical patterns at the neurological level. And we will find ways to get the same chemical composition happening again on the neurological level, so we can have that same experience. Now, this on first blush kind of feels a little bit counterintuitive, because who wants to like still be depressed the next day? Who wants to go to bed angry at night again? So, but there's actually an addictive loop at work within the body on that level, and it's linked with homeostasis, which of course is genius from an evolutionary point of view. but it's not going to change unless we find a way to consciously intervene. And this is a huge part of why so many people can stay stuck, like energetically super dense for like decades even. They're basically just the same energetic pattern, waking up the next day, enacting the same energetic pattern. I mean, I'm going to come back to the ways in which he says that we can intervene in this pattern, like in points 3, 4, and 5. But point number 2, before we get to that, is just some basic facts that, for example, our bodies create electromagnetic fields. This sounds obvious. When we're in a healthy state, we generate an induction current, and it goes between the top of our head and then the base of our spine. Now, I'm going to skip over like tons of nitty-gritty details here, but the point is that we work like a magnet, because we are polarized on these ends. And what that means is that a current can flow between them and around us, and it exchanges information with our environment. Now, that's its own topic, how this information is exchanged, what kind of information is exchanged, how it's carried, and this depends on our theories about that. But this is about our health. If this field becomes damaged, it will show up in our overall health as well. So when one or more of our energy centers, or the chakras, are caught in these cybernetic survival loops, as I've called them, they will end up diverting and storing energy that could have gone into this vital current, and it could have animated us at higher levels. And that vital current also keeps us in healthy connection with our environment. So think about a pool of water that's no longer connected with its stream, right? It gathers dirt and leaves, and you can no longer see it. It's no longer clean or clear. So the point here is that we need to keep these energy centers open and balanced and participating in the greater exchange that the vital induction current represents. This is our connection with the world. Okay, now point number 3 is also some interesting factual pieces that maybe you also haven't necessarily heard of before, but this is about the breath, and it answers the question as to why or how these energy centers are connected with this larger field. So again, really simplifying this, but basically we can learn to control our breath in such a way that we can use our cerebrospinal fluid to help release the stuck energy from these lower centers and help move this energy back upwards into our lower brain, where we can begin to use the energy for more creative purposes beyond just our survival patterns. Now, there's a few interesting points in here, some of which I was not fully aware of. This is really crucial, though. The first is that cerebral spinal fluid, probably it should be obvious, I guess, but it enhances the electrical charges throughout the body. So that's not surprising. Our whole system runs on fluctuations in sodium and potassium, like it's an electrical system. So it has this function of conducting the electrical energy. And the next point is that our autonomic breathing system also expands and contracts part of our skeletal system as we breathe. So it causes the sacrum to open or flex, and then even the sutures in our skull, which is really wild. And I guess I didn't know about that. So you can think of this like waves, and our skull is basically also breathing every time we breathe. So this is an oscillatory movement, and it helps with this induction current. Because again, the breath is, or can move the cerebrospinal fluid, which is a conducive material. It's like holding these electrical potentials and these electrical signals. So this is kind of like a pumping action, and it gets the electrons and ions and whatever else moving again. Point 4, moving along, as we bring our energy up into the brain, we also can upregulate our brain waves, which are probably hanging out in the beta range, which is what happens when, during the middle of the day, we're really focused on the outside world. What do we have to do next? This is all beta energy. So it's very associated with stress and focusing on the external world. But when we can move our energy up higher into the brain in this way that he's talking about, we can actually upregulate from beta into gamma, which is an even higher frequency, but it allows us to start to pay attention more to what's happening internally to register more internal signals. And it's also linked with more elevated emotions. So we already colloquially refer to these as higher vibe. And so there's actually a real link with this. When you're in a blissful state or like a really inspired state, like you can feel like so much about how that's like really coming from inside of you. Now, his point here, and I'll quote him, is that the more elevated the emotion, the faster the frequency, and the more you feel like energy instead of matter. And when you feel more like energy instead of matter, it's easier to change. So, on a biochemical level, this has to do with the chemistry that these emotions are producing, because the chemistry is what will signal the genetic framework of each cell to express certain aspects of our DNA and not others. So now this is point number 5, which is like really huge, like one of the engines of the argument for sure. Our emotions cause very specific genes to either upregulate or downregulate in terms of what they're expressing. So this is, again, it's another area where you can get really nitty gritty. So I'm not going to do that here, but he does have a list of specific genes that you might want to work towards upregulating for all kinds of reasons, including, for example, that they're actively involved in suppressing cancerous cells, which are basically almost always present in some degree for everyone, just like all the various microbes that live in our body. And this is, of course, the whole area of epigenetics, and it's still a pretty recent science. I think it's fascinating because, like, if you look at the boomer generation, they didn't have access to this research. Even genetics was still really new. So the paradigm back then was really like, whatever your genes are like already kind of your destiny. And now we know like how little actual truth there really is in that, because most of it is about this epigenetic action. Having conscious access at this level is one way we can really intervene into our neurological habit loops and then start to break out of the chemical addictions we are subconsciously used to on this layer. So also keep in mind too that this extends into healing intergenerational trauma, and that is highly governed by epigenetics. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend the book by Mark Wolin. It's called It Didn't Start With You. And fair warning though, this is a very powerful book and it's going to stir things up for you. So if you're sensitive like me, you may need to read it in small doses. Like I've heard from some people like how much crying it caused. So I'm just saying, fair warning. But super powerful, and you definitely should know that. Okay, so just to summarize all of this so far, this book is really about like it's giving you the tools to get unstuck, no matter how spiritual you want to get with this, how metaphysical you want to go or not. This is about how do you actually get unstuck, to get your energy flowing again, to regain energetic health by teaching you the power of the breath and specific exercises to help you move your energetic field higher. So then it does go beyond this too, and this is kind of really where part 2 of the topic would begin, because what this frequency and movement of energy does once it gets into the brain is to start to activate the tiny pineal gland through the mechanical current that is moving across the glands. Remember, we talked about the induction currents. And this current then also starts to activate the microscopic crystals inside the gland. So super cool. There's a lot of mythology and esoteric thought attached to this area of the brain, but his account doesn't get too deeply into that. He just does a really solid job of showing the logical and empirical links that show how the pineal gland does activate and how it does play a role as a receiver of frequencies. Now, from that point, we do enter some more speculative territory, only in the sense that we just don't have the same empirical, we haven't done the same empirical exploration there yet. We have a lot of really good metaphors, obviously, but we know that consciousness is not the same thing as information. And like the idea behind this is that, of course, certain types of information are being carried on specific frequencies That's what the pineal gland is picking up, and it's like transducing these into specific images that we can receive. And, he doesn't go much further or further in depth than that. But one point where I would intervene here is that he does, and I guess this is like, so maybe I have two caveats to talk about with this book. This will be the first one. So his whole account is really still it's a very coherent materialist analysis, which here it's not necessarily a bad thing, because he's using materialism correctly with its recognizing its natural limitations. He's not a dogmatic materialist. So this is kind of like an open-ended system, and he's talking about what has been necessarily testable, which is what's valuable on that account. So, but that said, going beyond this, there are many places where he will refer to consciousness as awareness and as information. And we do know that it's way more than that. It's way vaster than that. Both of those are reductions already. So equating consciousness with mere perceptual awareness is a reduction, and we already have evidence it goes way beyond that. It reaches well beyond any single individual's mind or the contents of their thoughts. So consciousness is vastly richer even than information, which itself is already a degradation of perceptual awareness. So if we want to say something otherwise, then we start moving into a territory where we're like redefining the nature of what information is. And then at that point, what we probably need a different concept, because information is a bunch of discrete units. It's the only way it works is because it is such a reduction. Okay, so this brings me to the second caveat, and I guess I'll just make this one point number 6. And that is that this book doesn't really go a lot beyond the 7 chakra schema. So he acknowledges that there are more than this, but he does kind of stop there. So in some yogic traditions, of course, there are like upwards of like 144 chakras. Others have even said like much higher than that. So this sounds like it's probably a degree of our sensitivity and our evolution and our understanding here. Certain centers coming online, of course, as we gain in our own awareness and integration. There's another issue here too with his layout of the energetic centers, and I feel like it's probably a distinction around how gender might influence the mapping of some of these networks, at least in the lower chakras. He's also got some very specific one-to-one mappings of certain emotions with like one particular chakra that I feel might be a bit too simplistic. I feel like we're dealing more with like networks, and where a given emotional experience is extended and engaged obviously across more than one energetic center. And that too is probably modulated by gender in ways that his studies, at least in this book, haven't really looked at. Again, so this is all just more advanced material. So I'll let this bring me to my final point, number 7, which is the importance of having an intellectual schema for all of this. One of the book's strengths is very much the care and concern he has with sharing with the reader the conceptual framework, the logical and empirical frameworks for why one would adopt these conclusions. He's not just giving you breathwork exercises. It's a full explanation so that, as he says, you'll be better able to invest your intention into what you're doing, because you'll also be able to accurately assign meaning to what you're doing. And I think that is so important. It's not enough just to have directions to the city. Like it will help a lot if we know why we're going, if we know why this route is better than another one, what we can expect, and so on. I just think it's important to emphasize that, because it's not like mere intellectualism. It's not just like, it's not living in our mind, or, the mind is so disparaged. We actually need these critical frameworks for exactly the reasons that he's been able to so eloquently express. So I really appreciate that. Like I said, I've been through most of the book so far, but one section I haven't yet read is the chapter on heart intelligence, and I'm probably looking forward to that one the most. It's one of the most exciting areas in the past few years in recent research, all the new data coming out on the role that our heart plays in a literal act of perception. This is cardiac perception. We knew it had its own neurological networks, it's a type of brain on its own, but cardiac perception is a very recent area of research, so it'll be interesting to see how much if he starts getting into discussing that yet. So, you guys, that will all be in my Substack review later this month, so do check that out. And I'm here to keep discussing these topics with you. Once you make your way into the book, leave a comment below whenever you're finding this, whenever you're reading this. You can also join my personal newsletter, and that's where I can invite you to join my private membership community, and we can continue discussing all of these topics there after the month is gone, and we want to keep talking about this. So let me know if this has raised any questions for you or piqued your interest in reading this book. I would love to hear about whether you're reading something similar right now or what's on your list next. I thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the comments.